my work that I'm going to talk to you today is stuff that I've done with Jan Gehl's office, which is Gehl Architects. Jan Gehl started working 50 years ago. I would like to point out yesterday was the 100th anniversary of Jane Jacobs' birth. And right around the time she was doing that, a young Jan Gehl was out lurking on street corners and whatnot, counting people, and developing this methodology, which is building on the work of Gehl Architects. He went out, looked at life between buildings, started talking about cities for people, and then has published How to Study Public Life, which pretty much says it all, you can say, in those books. But I'm going to tell you about it. So what this work is based on is kind of summing up much of what was talked about today, but critically recognizing that we are affected by the design of cities. Now, that may seem really obvious, but traditionally, every city and region has a lot of information about traffic and about movement, and has a lot of evidence about that, and has a lot of measurements about that kind of information, and very little information about people and pedestrians. Until very recently, there were no departments of people in cities. And yet, arguably, cities are made up of people, not cars, arguably. And when we talk about, as people who are interested in the built environment, and by which I include architects and transport planners and cyclists and artists and engineers and waste experts, et cetera, landscape architects, right? Product designers, geographers. Whenever we talk about what the biggest challenges are in cities, for cities, we talk to mayors, whoever we talk to, it's always coming down to transport. Movement of people is the biggest issue right now, up against a lot of practicalities of finance, the lack of finance and the intensity of transport. The thing is if we look at these things across all of this, again, coming from the Gehl Architects perspective, it's all people are at the heart of it. And we think this is the missing element all too often in what we do traditionally as people working in the built environment. I will continue to use architects as the generic term, including all of us from now on. The bottom line here is that you measure what you care about. And traditionally that means we've been measuring cars. And that means we've been focusing on cars. The post-World War II planning issues were about maximizing the efficiency of the vehicular movement, and then, we got the safety problem, so we better segregate the people, and now we're going to put up some more fences to make the kids safe, and suddenly we're in the environment that we're in now. What Jan Gehl did and what our office has been working on is then what we call a public space, public life methodology, which is putting people at the foreground and going out and actually studying people. You can read the books if you want the full details. But basically it's saying measuring people, looking at what people are doing, first and foremost, and then looking at the public space in terms of how that public space actually affects form. So that means going out and literally, physically, in person, counting and looking and watching at people. We started using GIS data and other means, but actually looking who's out there, what they're doing, how many they are, over the course of, you may not be able to see this, but over the course of a day, a course of a full 24-hour day, what's happening in the weekend and what's happening on a weekday in different places in town. Investigating who is there using the space, investigating how they're using the space. So I'm not sure what you guys can see back there. It looks kind of fuzzy, but if I want to go from point A to point B, all too often the efficiency of our traffic system requires us to ask for permission and practice our best Zen while we wait for permission to cross the street and go around a circuitous route which has been deemed the safest, but puts us at the bottom of the totem pole in terms of priority and importance. We actually use these studies also to go out and look at the quality of the street fabric. So what are we walking along? What's at human scale? How transparent are the facades? What kind of invitations are there to take part in the environment in terms of either good quality protection from the climate, or invitations to use the space, or places to stop and linger? All too often we think, and students, you are not alone in making this mistake, that if I make a big public space and put a bunch of cafes there, people will come. I promise you, when the financial crisis comes and all the Costas go out of business, you're screwed if you're relying on your public space to rely on that coffee shop, you know? And I can't afford a £3 latte. So what's really important is to start to think about how people are using it. Because the amount of people in a space is not a good indicator, we find, of the quality of the space. It's the amount of the people plus the time spent, which starts to indicate good quality space. A lot of people just might mean that, you know, there's a train station and a major employer, right? So that analysis helps us to understand the DNA of the place. Who's there, when they're there, why they're there, what kind of activities are bringing them there. And we critically look at this. There's several means, but we talk about this in terms of, again, public space and public life. When we use these forms to talk about what's going on there and what will be there, and we take these out forward then in our engagement processes to talk about what people might want there, whether that's the city or the public. I'm going to go through here now and say that this leads also, importantly, to the quality criteria. And this quality criteria was developed after much of this looking at cities, evaluating cities. And it starts to elaborate this in terms of 3 bands. Protection, that's like the Hippocratic Oath for architects, don't hurt anybody. Comfort, which talks about making it walkable and places to sit and stay and mixed functions and activity. And finally down here, getting to enjoyment and getting to the thing about aesthetics, which is all too often the thing that, at least in my architectural education, I thought I was supposed to pay attention to. The yummy, sexy materials, and if it's blue or if it's big and it's small and it's gray and it's long and it's thin and all those words, right? What the building wants to be. And actually, you know, that can be a lot of different things, but if it doesn't do all of this, the public space fails. And that's what's really important, because the public space is the place of common use and of social use. So I was trained as a building architect and practiced as a building architect. I still love doorknobs, but I actually think the stuff before the doorknob is maybe more important. Why this stuff matters is as a brief example. New York City, Gehl Architects, we worked in New York City. You may know this project. Going with the Department of Transportation when Mayor Bloomberg was the mayor to transform Times Square of this into Times Square of this. It was a tactical urbanism pilot project, etc. But it was critically set up on a lot of observations that showed us there is no square in Times Square. There is actually 89% of the space is used by 11% of the users, i.e. cars are 11% of users, but they have 90% of the space, basically. And the 90% of the people who are walking in things other than cars are given 11% of the space. I know that didn't add up to 100. But the point is that the mayor actually hired us to go out and look at ways to improve traffic, congestion, and make the place safer. We're not talking about making pretty people places and human scale and placemaking, because that doesn't buy us any votes. And that's not economically viable, and there's not evidence for that. Who cares if they're happy? Let's make them safe. So we actually proposed closing down, we'll get there, closing down parts of places where you could no longer cross the street with a vehicle, and making those into people-focused spaces. This is all really temporary, down and dirty paint initially, and allowing the traffic to move through. It's the data that's necessary to frame the situation politically. And that is because the taxi drivers are a strong union, you don't want to piss them off. And all those 90% of the people on the road who are crammed onto the pavements, those are your voters. They vote. And when they're angry, they might vote more often. So you got to capture that. And actually, this is what we were trying to deal with, is to change that dynamic. It's putting people into the planning process. And part of our study was also looking at who's out there. And demographically, is it showing up in our studies the same way as what the census might be telling us? Now, Mayor Bloomberg liked numbers. He didn't get to be a billionaire by luck. And what we actually saw here is the really critical numbers that won the day and made that tactical pilot project urbanism stand up and still be there today is things like 30% fewer fatalities, 50% less speeding, a decline in traffic volumes. But the one that's not on here is really important, is there was a 17% increase in trip distance, in efficiency, not speed actually, but the taxi cabs could get from point A to point B 17% faster. And that is like your big win, right? Because it made it all safer. It made more people be on the road because it was safer, but the critical numbers was the taxi drivers didn't feel like anything was taken away from them either. Everybody was winning, okay, no matter who you were. And we saw land values go up, we saw rental vacancies go down, and that kind of thing. So the data here is really important, and the data was always focused at the people level, but it's by holistically looking across that made us understand how to make it transform that. Moving forward, I'm going to go through this super fast, but this has been taken out. The Department of Transportation is now taking this out, and we're looking at more local plazas, places that are not as glamorous as Times Square, perhaps, out in Queens and the meatpacking district and whatnot. And here we're actually now doing intercept surveys to actually talk to people about what do you think of the space, how are you using it, how do you, how comfortable do you feel like this is yours, how much ownership do you have? And our initial findings are finding that when you give people these public spaces and they're local, that we're actually starting to recognize that the local places foster more interaction between people. Maybe that's because you actually know your neighbor, but perhaps it's also because there's fewer people and you see them more often. We're seeing that people, more people are saying, again, that it's their own plaza. They feel a sense of ownership in that, and they also feel some sort of sense of stewardship, which is a very Boy Scout American idea, but again, one that I think should be at the heart of everything we do. But there's a sense of stewardship to the place. Now, we also are starting to take this information, therefore, on all that data. It's not enough just to say there's got to be people, but as I intimated earlier, it's who is there. Some of the studies we've done in various cities have shown us that there's a lot of people in the space, but the demographics tell us there's a lot of old people, or there are a lot of children, and yet we don't see them out in the space. And that seems like a really big hurdle of the next sort of target of where we're working right now. We've got a big grant with the Knight Foundation in the US to start looking at that and start to find out how you can actually make those local places better and safer for the 8-year-olds and the 80-year-olds. Because the 23-year-olds of the world will go to any dangerous, dirty, unsafe, funky part of town and build a brewery. But it's the 8-year-old that when those 23-year-olds start breeding, you want to have your good place for your kid to go to school, right? So whipping through, that's the bunch of data on all that you don't need to know about. It's applying these 4 tools, and what this means is the summation of this in a bunch of slides. This means that for all of this data to come to fruition, it means that going back into the planning policy and back into the cities, we actually are noticing that there's a change in how we're working in cities. So that in this time of austerity, not just in the UK, but across the US and Europe, is that municipal governments are now starting to be facilitators rather than doers. That's coming out of a different set of community engagement. There's a lot more bottom-up work. And what that means is that the city is starting to reconsider what value means. So when we talk about cycling in Copenhagen, it's not, oh, isn't it nice that all those people cycle? It's that there's a 25 euro cent gain to society per kilometer for every person who transfers from a car to bicycle. That's a gain, that's an economic gain to the state by working with cycles. Again, who cares if it's nice and healthy and environmentally safe? It's making us money that we can spend in other parts of our society. It's meaning that we have fewer people who are absent for work, less absences from school, people staying in the workforce healthier, longer. Again, our society is gaining economically, and those things are really matter. So again, I just sort of talk about the way that you put people first. Evidence is the first order of business. The second thing is how you start to tie it together, right? And again, going back to New York, talking about these increases in economic numbers, increase in retail sales, decrease in vacancies. What that means, I know I've got like 2 seconds. What that means is that, again, changing from this silo way of thinking, and I think that starts here in this building, that we don't work as architects and geographers and landscape architects, but we actually work together to start thinking of how we look. We start thinking about shared responsibility, and that we start looking at that space between buildings, that's what that drawing is, it's the street, as our own shared responsibility, one thing. That means that we've got to tie up also a lot of boring things for architecture students, but at a city level, it means that the city's got to have the parking revenue and the healthcare numbers and the public art budgets. They've got to start looking at those things holistically and together rather than as separate entities, because the savings out of one pot will buy you something in another pot. And that's been a really big change. The only way you get there, in turn, is by working strategically. And that goes back to my 12-point criteria slide. It's not about the sexy object. We need people to do beautiful objects because, God, I want the world to be filled with Alvar Aalto and early Saarinen and things like that. But we have to have the strategy to get us there so that we can find ways to do it, right? Ultimately, then, it's saying that this all comes down to this measure, test, refine attitude of working, which is kind of the thing we all learn in school. We're supposed to have lots of iterations and work over things and test and test and test them a lot. And I'm just saying we've got to get back to that in actual real live world practice. And the evidence is the thing that helps you get there. That's probably it. Yeah, that's it. That was over.